You're listening to the Happiest Lives Podcast with Jill Lillard, episode 100.
Welcome to the Happiest Lives Podcast, where you'll learn to think better, feel better, and become the woman God says you already are. Here's your host, Jill Lillard.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Happiest Lives Podcast. Thank you guys for joining me today as we continue our journey through the first 25 chapters of Genesis. So studying these chapters has been such a blessing to me, and I hope it's been enriching for you as I've shared my takeaways. And I have to say, today is extra special because this is my 100th episode. Yay! It's definitely worth waiting for. From episode 1 to 100, I've learned so much along the way. And isn't it that way in life from a beginning to a check-in point? There was a lot of things that happened in the middle, and who we are now is not who we were at the beginning. If you've been blessed by this podcast, I'd love for you to leave a review. Your feedback means the world to me, and it helps others find this podcast as well. As a quick reminder, this series was inspired by my time using the Listening Heart Journal. It's a wonderful tool that I have designed for you that encourages you to slow down, ask meaningful questions, and truly listen as you study God's Word. It's helped me deepen my reflections and connect more intimately with Scripture. If you're interested, you can get your copy at myhappyvault.com. I'll stick one in the mailbox to you. Just a reminder though, there's a limited number available, so you'll want to grab one soon. Over the past few weeks, we've explored Genesis as the beginning of God's beautiful love story with us. We've acknowledged our human frailty and God's unwavering grace, and we dove into the complexities of relationships. So if you missed any of these episodes, please check them out. Today, we're going to talk about something that touches all of us: waiting. Sometimes God asks us to wait, and if you're anything like me, patience doesn't always come easy. But as we'll see, these early chapters of Genesis offer profound lessons on the beauty of trusting in God's perfect timing. So let's dive in together and discover the wisdom that Genesis has to offer about waiting. In the Hebrew language, the word for wait is kavah, which carries a rich and active meaning. It originates from a word that means to bind together. So imagine twisting strands of a rope to form something strong and enduring. This imagery suggests that waiting is not a passive state where nothing is happening. It is an active process of intertwining our hearts, our hopes, and our strength with God's purposes. So I know when I'm waiting, it often feels like nothing is happening, like I'm wasting my time. I envision how things should be, and I feel frustrated when they're not yet there. However, if we change our perspective to see waiting as a time when God is binding our hearts to His, well, that changes everything. I have a painting across from my bed that I see every night when I go to bed and every morning when I wake up. And if I take a nap, I see it then again. It says, "Bind my wandering heart to thee." Now, this painting serves as a gentle nudge that even when I'm feeling like I'm just waiting, that nothing's happening, that all this time is being wasted, God is at work. He is doing something. So when I think life should look a certain way and it doesn't look that way, I tell myself that He is binding my heart to His. There is a purpose in the wait, and the wait will be worth it. And for that, I am so very grateful. Consider Isaiah 40:31, which says, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles." In this context, waiting is about anchoring our hope to God, trusting His perfect timing, and allowing Him to shape us. As we envision the Lord binding our hearts to His, our strength is renewed. It's a dynamic engagement with God's will, where our anticipation and trust are woven together with His divine plans, knowing they come from a place of loving kindness. In light of this, let's look at Noah's story in Genesis 6-9. where we see how waiting unfolds in 3 distinct seasons, each of which teaches us something powerful about God's timing. The first season is the building season, where waiting requires obedience. The second season is the waiting season, where patience and discernment are key. And finally, there is the season of renewal, where God's faithfulness is fully revealed. Here's how each of these seasons played out in Noah's life. The season of building. While the Bible doesn't tell us the exact length of time it took Noah to build the ark, we know from Noah's age that it took about 100 years. This was about 10% of Noah's life because he lived to be 950 years old. So you can imagine this being about 10 years of your life if you lived to 90 years old. And so this is a long and steadfast period of obedience. During this time, Noah followed God's instructions to build the ark. This was a huge project, and it required faith and it required perseverance, especially when everyone outside of him were laughing at him. Each day he selected and prepared the wood and the materials that God directed him to use, and he followed these precise dimensions that God gave him. God gave him this plan to follow. And even though those around him were skeptical, he endured doing the work that God called him to do. And so for Noah, this was a season of patience as he continued to work faithfully without seeing any sign of a flood. The next season was the season of waiting, and this was around a year. So after the rain began, Noah and his family were in the ark for nearly a year. The rain lasted 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters remained on the earth for 150 days. Even after the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, Noah continued to wait, sending out a raven and then a dove to assess the situation. His waiting was filled with patience, discernment, and careful observation. It wasn't a time of idleness, but a season of hopeful anticipation and trust in God's perfect timing. For Noah, waiting was an active process of being still and listening to God's guidance. He then moved into the third season, the renewal season. Finally, God called Noah out of the ark to begin anew, marking a fresh covenant with a rainbow as a symbol of his promise. Stepping onto dry ground, Noah built an altar and offered sacrifices to God, expressing gratitude and acknowledging God's faithfulness throughout the waiting period. We know that this marked the beginning of a new phase in Noah's life, a season of restoration and renewal where God's faithfulness was fully revealed. The covenant God made with Noah and his descendants would last for generations, offering hope and security for the future. Every season of waiting serves a purpose. Noah's time wasn't wasted. It was a process of preparation, endurance, and ultimately renewal. God's plans unfolded not through shortcuts, but through steadfast faith. So what about you? Are you in a season of building, or are you in a season of waiting? Or maybe you're in that season of renewal. When I was a baby till I was about 5 years old, my parents lived far from their families in Colorado, while most of their loved ones were in Jefferson City, Missouri. Now, my dad often tells the story of how he felt God clearly told him that they would move back to Missouri. He fully was convinced of this, and he immediately set to work applying for jobs, knocking on every door he could find. But every door was closed. Each opportunity fell through, leaving him confused and discouraged. Finally, he prayed, God, I thought you told me we were supposed to move to Missouri. What's going on? This story resonates deeply with me because, like my dad, I tend to be a person of action. When I sense God is calling me to do something, I want to move. I want to make it happen. I get eager to see the outcome and often try to push things along. But sometimes God invites us to trust his timing rather than to rush ahead with our own efforts. Sometimes he'll make a promise to us, and yet he will be the one to fulfill that promise. Now, I know some of us need to take more action. God is calling you to take action. Like Jonah, he wants you to get out there and go, and maybe you're hiding away. This is not the problem that I usually have, and this is not the problem my dad was having. Eventually, my dad stopped striving. He released his plans into God's hands. And then, Out of the blue, he received a call from a college friend who had started a growing CPA firm in Missouri. His friend asked if my dad would move back to Jefferson City and join him. What my dad couldn't force through effort, God unfolded in his perfect timing. So sometimes God is telling you to take more effort, but other times he is revealing something to you and asking you to wait on him. So we want to make sure we're striving with the energy God places in us, and we're not doing our own human sort of striving through our own efforts that leave us exhausted and at dead-end roads. This experience mirrors several stories in the first 25 chapters of Genesis where individuals believed in God's promises. They tried to make them happen through their own efforts, and ultimately they had to wait on God's perfect timing. The story of Abraham and Sarah is one example. They had a 25-year wait for their son Isaac. This is more than a tale of waiting for a child. It's a powerful lesson on faith, trust, and the refining work God does in us while we wait. At 75 years old, Abraham received the promise from God that he would become the father of many nations. This was a monumental promise, especially considering that Sarah was barren and both were advanced in age. They set out on a journey, not just physically to a new land, but spiritually into deeper trust in God's plan. Even though it seemed impossible, God was setting the stage for something much bigger than they could imagine. As the years passed without the promise being fulfilled, Sarah's impatience led her to take matters into her own hands. She suggested that Abraham have a child with her maidservant Hagar, resulting in the birth of Ishmael. This was their attempt to help God fulfill his promise, something we often do when we grow weary in waiting. But as we discussed in last week's episode, this decision only brought tension and complication into their family dynamics. It was a reminder that our impatience and striving can sometimes lead us down difficult paths, but even in those moments, God's grace is greater still. At the appointed time, Sarah conceived and bore Isaac. The birth of Isaac was not just a fulfillment of God's promise, but a reminder that God's timing is always perfect. Sarah declared, "God has brought me to laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The joy and laughter that followed Isaac's birth highlighted the miraculous nature of God's faithfulness, proving that his promises are worth the wait. It wasn't just about the child. It was about the journey. During those 25 years, Abraham and Sarah were learning to trust God's timing. The waiting refined their faith and grew their dependence on God. Even when they made mistakes trying to fulfill God's promises in their own way, God's grace was there to meet them. They were being transformed into the people who could receive the promise when the time was right. Waiting refines us. It teaches us to depend on God, his timing, and not our own striving. It grows our faith and it helps us trust in his plan, even when things don't unfold as we expect. Even when we try to rush ahead, God's grace is greater. His promises are never delayed. They are simply unfolding in his perfect time. So are you waiting for God to fulfill a promise in your life? What would it look like to trust his timing, especially when the results aren't immediately visible? Take a moment to think about the areas where impatience is tempting you to take control. Surrender those moments to God, trusting that his plan is always better and his timing is always perfect. Waiting teaches us to rely on God more, even when we can't see what's coming. It's in the waiting that we start to trust him more deeply, knowing he's got it all under control, even when we feel uncertain. Waiting isn't always easy, but it's a chance for us to grow. It builds patience. It helps us to become more humble, and it shows us how to keep going when things don't move as quickly as we'd like. And sometimes the waiting is all part of preparing us for something bigger. It's like God is getting us ready for a blessing that's just around the corner, and the waiting helps us handle it well when it arrives. So I want to give you 3 tips that you can put into action if you are in a season of waiting. Number 1, view waiting as purposeful preparation. Understand that this period isn't wasted. It's meant to help you grow and get ready for what's ahead. Number 2, shift your focus from the outcome to God's presence. Instead of stressing about the result, focus on being present with God and listening for his guidance through the waiting process. Number 3, let waiting strengthen your hope. Allow the waiting to build your hope. Each moment brings you closer to God's heart and his plans for your life. Waiting is not a passive or meaningless time. It's a divinely appointed season that draws us closer to God. In these moments, our faith is strengthened, our character is shaped, and our relationship with the Creator deepens. As you walk through your own season of waiting, remember that it is worth the wait. God is faithful, his timing is perfect, and his promises never fail. Embrace the waiting, because it's in these seasons that God does some of his most powerful work, aligning us with his perfect will. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for listening to the Happiest Lives podcast. If you're tuning in on the Apple Podcast app, please give this podcast a 5-star rating and drop a review. If you're listening on Spotify, make sure you follow and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. I truly appreciate your support. And remember, wherever you are in this season of life, make sure that you're always turning toward the Lord. He is with you, and the wait is always worth it. Trust that his timing and his plans are perfect. Quick question. Have you grabbed your free mini course, The 4 Things You Must Do to Become the Happiest Wife? I'd love to give you 4 simple tips plus a free workbook to help you process your relationship and find greater satisfaction. Sign up today at myhappyvault.com and I'll show you how to change your marriage without the exhausting work of trying to control your husband. And if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend who needs encouragement. See you next time.